Hi, this is Dennis Consorti with Politipeeps, and I'm here with Jonathan Grassmick. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Dennis?
I'm doing well. Now, Jonathan, we're going to talk about climate change today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your education?
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and from a very young age, I just loved the natural environment. I loved animals. I think the first thing I wanted to be when I was a kid was Tarzan. I wanted to live in the jungle, and I just wanted to be a part of nature. As I grew up, though, I decided to pursue a education in environmental science. So I got a degree in environmental science from Stephen F. Austin State University in East Texas, and I have a minor in forestry. And when I graduated, I was pretty lucky that I was able to get a job working for a private landowner doing some wildlife habitat rehabilitation. So I've been working in the field of ecology and wildlife habitat for the last going on 15 years now.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so how much of your time would you say you spend studying ecology and the climate and that sort of thing?
It takes up a lot of my time, actually. The climate thing is more of that's not something I do in my day-to-day activities. That's kind of a hobby for me because politics is also a hobby for me. So I really like to keep up with politics. And the climate change issue is just something that's always on the forefront of politics these days. So because of how much it has to do with the things that I'm passionate about, like the environment, like ecology, it seems like a natural fit for me to really study that. So I do that more in my own time. But there is some crossover. I do experience some climate change issues in my job. Specifically, if I'm pursuing a grant, to do some of these habitat restoration projects, I do feel pressure sometimes to put in language in there about how it will benefit the climate change issue.
Wow, that's really interesting. Is
Yeah.
there a way you could give me an example of that by chance?
Yeah. So, whenever we're pursuing a grant, particularly a federally funded grant, there are certain things that the grant assessors are looking for in order to fund the project. So it goes through several iterations of people looking over it and making sure that it meets all the requirements. And so during that process, there will be reviewers who will say, well, it needs this, it needs that, and many times they will say, well, this is a great project, but it doesn't have anything in there about climate change, so you need to add some language about climate change to increase your chances of it getting funded.
Wow, that's really interesting, and maybe we'll get into that in one of the next segments. But you did mention politics. How would you describe your political views?
I think that I've gone through kind of a political evolution, in the last 20 years or so. I was fairly conservative for a long time, and I still consider myself pretty conservative, but I have become a lot more libertarian in my political beliefs in the last decade or so, I'd say. So I think I'm fiscally conservative. I consider myself more of a libertarian. I really would say that like if you want to just put it in terms of like the current president, Trump, I'm not pro-Trump. I'm kind of more anti-Trump. I feel that there are a lot of people out there who are just so anti-Trump that it just bogs their thinking. So for me, I try to think in terms of what's best for just my overall ideology, and not in terms of a political party or one person that I may or may not agree with.
Now, would you say that your current political views reflect your attitude towards debate and, say, questioning commonly held beliefs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm a skeptic by nature. I've always been that way. I've always questioned, and that's kind of really a part of why I pursued the career I did. Scientific minds are supposed to be skeptical, and you're supposed to always question and not go with just the prevailing wisdom necessarily.
Yeah, but the prevailing wisdom does say that climate change is something that we need to be deeply concerned about. And
Right.
you have kids. How important do you believe it is to ensure a prosperous future and a clean environment for them?
I think it's very important, and that's one of the things that kind of drives me a little crazy about people who are a lot of times on the left side of the political spectrum. They'll paint a picture as if people on the right they don't care about the environment. They don't care about clean air and clean water. But everybody cares about clean air and clean water. And from my perspective, the best way to make sure that happens is the pathway to get there is radically different than what they're proposing. They're proposing government action, and I think that the best way to do that is on an individual level. If we ensure that everybody is wealthy enough to be able to actually do things to make the air and the water cleaner and make sure that we have a clean environment, that's the most efficient way to make that happen.
Yeah, so it sounds like you actually want a lot of the same outcomes that people on the left want. You just want to get there a different way.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate way of putting it.
Okay, and you mentioned science. So how would you define science, and what are the criteria for good science versus bad science?
Science is the pursuit of knowledge, really. So there's the scientific method, and we need to make sure that we follow that method rigorously so that we're not allowing our biases to come in and pollute those findings. So that's really best way to ensure that science is done properly.
Yeah, makes sense. And we're going to get into some of that, but first let's establish some common ground before we get into some of the challenges that we have. One of the pieces of legislation that was put through a long time ago was to require car manufacturers to install catalytic converters. Can you describe what catalytic converters do and how important that is?
Yeah, sure. So a car engine, basically, when it burns fuel, it doesn't burn it completely. So there are particles like carbon monoxide that are produced when a car engine burns the gasoline. So what a catalytic converter does is it reburns the unburnt fuel and just provides an opportunity for the engine to produce less emissions.
Is this beneficial in certain environments?
Yeah, in a city, when a car burns the fuel and it releases carbon monoxide without a catalytic converter, that carbon monoxide will go into the atmosphere, and over time it will combine with another oxygen, and it will become carbon dioxide, which is a harmless, actually beneficial gas. So in a city setting, though, when you have all these cars that are producing carbon monoxide, there isn't enough oxygen in the air around all these cars to gobble up all that carbon monoxide and convert it over to carbon dioxide. So that's when you get a situation where you have smog that settles over the city, and it's basically just the problem of too much of that carbon monoxide in one location at one time. So naturally, carbon monoxide does convert over to carbon dioxide. So catalytic converters, they're there for a reason, mostly to prevent smog in big cities.
Okay, so that's something that you would consider a good regulation.
The legislation that required catalytic converters on cars, what is something that is a point of contention. People often say, well, legislation was required for catalytic converters to clean up the cities. So, why can't we do something like the Green New Deal? So people will make this big step from catalytic converters to these big, broad, sweeping things. And And I'm not against legislation like catalytic converters. I think I'm fairly practical when it comes to the government and the need for government. We do need some government. We do need some legislation, particularly in places like big cities where people live close together and there are a lot of externalities that will, impact other people. So some of that legislation is definitely founded. If it's common sense legislation, I'm all for it. I just don't want these broad sweeping legislation packages that really that may not have an impact or the impact that they claim will be.
Yeah, I feel like legislation tends to be different in urban versus more rural environments, and the requirements, like you said, are different in those requirements. When you have people densely populated versus more space between people, you can do things a lot differently. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you, we've had a number of bans and regulations enacted due to ecological concerns. We mentioned catalytic converters. There are some other ones. I remember banning CFCs and DDT.
Right.
Do you see a place for environmental regulations and bans?
Yeah, absolutely. When the EPA was instituted, I believe it was back in the 70s under Nixon, I think that it was needed. That they did a lot of really good things, and they passed legislation that really helped the environment. And there are stories of a river, I think in Pennsylvania, that actually caught fire because of the pollution. So there were things that needed to be done, and government was the vehicle that was able to get that legislation passed and solve the problem. But then I think that it went too far. I think that the EPA then, they kind of ran out of things to do. People started to get the message, and we cleaned up the environment, and then they started to take it to the next level, where the regulations were really to the point where they were hamstringing business, and then you start to affect the economy. And then when the economy worsens, people aren't as wealthy, and when people aren't as wealthy, then they end up having to just do what they need to do to survive, and that really hurts the environment more than if you were to just allow people to do the things that they would naturally want to do anyway, which is to have a clean environment.
Okay, so you saw a need for the EPA when it was formed, but now maybe not so much. And now we've got new climate legislation on the table, like the Green New Deal.
Right.
What's your greatest concern about how climate science is conducted today as an ecologist?
I think the biggest concern is just that it's gotten too political. There are too many political forces at play, and there are things like the noble cause corruption. Where people get into a field like climate science to save the world or to do something great, and I sympathize with that, because that's why I got into the field I got into. I do have a passion for the environment and for wildlife, and I want to see them preserved. So I think that a lot of times people get into those fields for the right reasons, but then if they start to see things that don't necessarily go with their preconceived notions, they that confirmation bias is hard for them to overcome. So they'll see problems where there are no problems, and they won't acknowledge that maybe there's not a problem where they thought it existed before. So I think that's one of the biggest issues that we have in science now.
Got it. Okay, and we'll get into more depth on that in one of the next segments. But for now, Jonathan, how do people find you online?
Yeah, you can find me just by searching my name. I just kind of poked my head into the Twitter universe, so you can try to find me there. I think I'll start posting some more things on Twitter and then Facebook as well. So just search Jonathan Grassmick, and you can find me those places.
All right, sounds good. So, Jonathan, thank you for this segment. We're going to interview you a couple more times. This is Dennis from Politipeeps. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell icon for notifications.